Last year, Tom Brokaw wrote a book called The Greatest Generation. In reading Brokaw's book, I picked out one excerpt here that I'd like to read to you, is to kind of set the stage for tonight. Quote, "At a time when their days and nights should have been filled with innocent adventure, love, and the lessons of the workaday world, they were fighting in the most primitive conditions possible across the bloodied landscape of France, Belgium, Italy, Austria, and the Coral Islands of the Pacific. They answered the call to save the world from the two most powerful and ruthless military machines ever assembled, instruments of conquest in the hands of fascist maniacs. They faced great odds and a late start, but they did not protest. They succeeded on every front. They won the war. They saved the world. They came home to joyous and short-lived celebrations and immediately began the task of rebuilding their lives and the world they wanted. They married in record numbers and gave birth to another distinctive generation, the baby boomers. A grateful nation made it possible for more of them to attend college than any society had ever educated anywhere. They gave the world new science, literature, art, industry, and economic strength unparalleled in the long curve of history. As they now reach the twilight of their adventurous and productive lives, they remain, for the most part, exceptionally modest. They have so many stories to tell, stories that in many cases they have never told before, because in a deep sense, they didn't think that what they were doing was that special, because everyone else was doing it. Tonight, we hear Frank Abraham's story.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. My big brother, Buck Abraham, is a rather famous, fabulous, fun-loving, joke-telling East Texas character. He still lives up in Tyler, Texas, in deep East Texas, with his wife, Joyce. And this is a story that he has told for the past 55 years a zillion times. And he is a magnificent storyteller. Fact is, we sent him an invitation, and he really was going to come down and participate in this celebration for freedom. And I wish he could have come, but he had a little respiratory problem. He said he might walk in any minute, but he couldn't take part in the actual storytelling. And that must hurt Buck awful much, because he is a Jesse of a storyteller. But the way Buck tells his story, and I've heard it before, and I'm paraphrasing, but Buck was flying B-24s out of Sicily in the 8th Army in World War II, and on one mission, his formation took off around Hungary in order to circumvent some of the artillery. And when they got near a town in northwestern Hungary called Garzi, they ran into terrific anti-aircraft barrage. His plane was mortally wounded and was going down. The navigator had a badly injured thigh, and they bound him up best they could to stop the bleeding, and gave him some morphine, and they parachuted him out first. And after all the crew parachuted out, Buck parachuted out the last one. And he saw the plane go down and crash just after he bailed out. As he was coming down in a field, Buck noticed some some small arms fire that didn't hit him but had pierced his parachute. So he said that he fell rather abruptly to the ground, sustained a brain concussion, several broken bones, and a badly jarred body. Buck said it's kind of like jumping off of a 4-story building. He was unconscious for a while, and when he came to, he was set upon by a band of marauding Hungarians. There was an old man in a big hat and a beard that had a double-barreled shotgun. And Buck said when he came to, he leveled that shotgun over Buck's forward. And he said he had a bad case of palsy, and Buck was kind of worried with him shaking the other Hungarians mistreated Buck pretty badly with sticks and pitchforks, took him into town. But when he got into the jail, he found that a lot, if not all, of his crew had been captured and were in jail. A couple of weeks later, Buck was taken over by the Germans, and in the next 7 months, he was in 3 German prison camps. He was first in Stalag II, then in Stalag III, and then in a big internment camp in Moosburg. As the Germans moved from the east to the west, they moved the prisoners over and got in bigger camps. It was in Moosburg that some of Buck's best friends, prisoners, were very despondent and were considering the possibility of escape. And they were plotting to escape and wanted Buck to get with them on it. And Buck said, no, I'm not worried. I'm going to stay right here. Buck says he said that my little brother is in the infantry, and I know when he finds out where I am, he's going to come get me. If you all just take it easy, he'll be here shortly. You can imagine their amazement when 2 weeks later, the first Jeep that came into the prison camp and came down toward Buck was none other than his little kid brother, yours truly, Frankie Thomas Abraham. His fellow campers who had heard him boast about his little brother saving him thought Buck was psychic. Buck kind of thinks he's psychic. I always thought when we were growing up that he not only knew what I was thinking, but he knew what I was going to think before I even thought of it. We were very close growing up. In fact, we were only 18 months apart. But Buck was bigger than I, about a head taller, and more robust than I, and more outgoing than I, and more self-assured than I. Our folks called us in unison the boys. Where are the boys? Where are we going to feed the boys? What are we going to do with the boys if we go out? Buck and I called each other Bubba because it started off I couldn't say brother, and so I said Bubba, and he called me Bubba, and I called him Bubba. And sometimes he would call me Brother Baby. I think that Buck thought, and probably my dad too, that my mother had a tendency to baby me a little too much. And I thought she did too, and I enjoyed every moment of it. Anyway, from the very beginning, Buck was my caretaker, was put in charge. He was my security blanket. He was my trailblazer. He was my running back. He ran interference for me. He was my protector. I was kind of growing up a skinny-legged little Dennis the Menace type, but if anybody picked on me, they would have to account to my big brother, Buck Abraham. And Buck would step in and take over, and they would back away until Buck left, and then they'd start again. But Buck loved life. He was always getting into things and projects. He was a positive thinker. In fact, his famous saying was, "Life is just a bowl of cherries." My dad nicknamed Buck after a big bucktail West Texas rabbit that would hopping around and always sniffing into stuff. And he thought Buck was kind of that way, always into something. When Buck went off to college at A&M, I was completely lost. I was like a boat without a rudder or a ship without a sail. I was in a complete quandary. I had lost my mentor, my confidant, my advisor, my counselor, my supporter, my protection. I was kind of left vulnerable to the world. But I managed by perseverance to graduate from Tyler High School the ripe old age of 17 in the spring of 1941. In September of 1941, my mother took me down to Austin to the University of Texas and registered me as a freshman at the university. On December the 7th, 1941, the Japs, as you know, bombed Pearl Harbor, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared war against the whole schmear. That was before I had finished my first semester at the university. Shortly thereafter, Buck dropped out of school and joined the Air Force. He had his flight training at Harlingen Air Force Base. He went to San Antonio Air Force Base and got his wings and commission. They sent him to Pine Bluff, Arkansas Air Force Base to study to be a bomber pilot. And then they put him in the 8th Air Corps to go overseas. When he got his last furlough before going overseas and came by Tyler, I wasn't there, but my folks told me that they took Buck up to Love Field to see him off to go overseas. And my Dallas relatives, my grandmother and my aunts and uncles and cousins, all came down to the lobby of the Love Field to see Buck off. And while they were there, my aunt said, "Oh, Buck, they've announced your plane is leaving." Buck reached around and grabbed 2 big suitcases and walked down one of those long corridors and hustling with those 2 suitcases, and he got smaller and smaller, and then he stopped and turned around and dropped one and said, "Oh, I forgot. Goodbye, you all." And then he said, "If I never see you again, it sure has been nice knowing you." Me, in the meanwhile, back at the 40 acres, without Buck to counsel me and advise me, I joined the Army Enlisted Reserve Corps with the promise that they would send me back to college in the Army Specialized Training Corps to study basic engineering, and they did. They first took me out and sent me to basic training up at Camp Maxey in Paris. That's Paris, Texas, not Paris, France. They put we AST peers in what they call the Jap Trap, which was a bunch of Quonset huts that had a barbed wire fence around it. And at that time, they didn't even have any latrines. They just had 55-gallon GI cans that they hauled in ever so often. But when we graduated or completed our basic training, they made everybody that did a PFC, private first class. And I hitchhiked home through Dallas and went by to see my Dallas grandmother. And she reached out and gave me a big hug. I had told her that I'd been made PFC, and she said, "Frank Thomas, I'm so proud of you. I always knew you were first class." In the ASTP, they put me back in school at East Texas State Teachers College. And I was there for one semester studying basic engineering. And then after D-Day, the troops that landed in Normandy and went into France took their replacement from divisions back in the United States, two divisions I know of, the 106th and the 99th, that were waiting to go overseas, just about to go overseas. And then the Army took everybody out of the ASTP and that was in college and put them in to replace the replacements that had been sent over to the divisions overseas. We weren't in the 99th Division long back at Camp Maxey before we shipped out again. But before we did, the company commander of Company G, 395th Infantry, made me the first scout of the company. The sergeant told me that in combat, my mission was to draw the enemy's fire. When I went home to Tyler, hitchhiked again home to Tyler to visit him before we went overseas, I told everybody at the dinner table that I'd been made first scout. My mission was to draw the enemy's fire, and they all congratulated me and everything. And the next day, my mother kind of got me aside, and she said, "Frank Thomas, I'm proud that you made first scout, but I really don't think you're qualified for that job. You're small, and it'd be hard for the enemy to see you. And I think that you're more qualified for a desk job like mail clerk." Anyway, when we shipped out to go up to Boston, to Fort Miles Standish, to the port of de-embarkation, it took about 3 or 4 weeks to get 30,000 men up to the port. And in the meantime, after we got up there, we all got a handful of mail. And one of the things I got was a church bulletin, and on the back of it, it said that Lieutenant Robert S. Abraham, that's Buck, was missing in action over Italy. And I was, of course, concerned and worried. And I was a little put out. I had all kind of letters from my folks, but I was a little put out that I had to learn about Buck being missing in action from the church bulletin. Now, I read through all my folks' emails, and they hadn't said anything about it. And then I got to thinking about it, that they were pretty uptight with me going overseas as first scout and Buck missing in action. And so all the rest of the time, I would write them as much as I could, and they would write me, but we never did say anything about me knowing that Buck was missing in action. I didn't think about it at the time, but later on, I remembered a declamation I said way back in early schooling about a father seeing his son off to World War I, called "Young Fellow, My Lad" by Robert W. Service. "Where are you going, young fellow, my lad, on this glittering morn of May?" "Well, I'm going to join the colors, Dad. They're looking for men, they say." "But you're only a boy, young fellow, my lad. You're not obliged to go." "Well, I'm 17 and a quarter, Dad, and pretty darn strong, you know." "So you're off to France, young fellow, my lad. and you're looking so fit and bright. I'm terribly sorry to leave you, Dad, but I feel that I'm doing right. God bless you and keep you, young fellow, my lad. You're all that I've got, you know. Don't worry. I'll soon be back, dear Dad, and I'm awfully proud to go. Why don't you write, young fellow, my lad? I watch for the post each day. I miss you so, and I'm awfully sad, and it's months since you went away. I hear them tell we've gained new ground, but a terrible price we paid. God grant, my boy, that you're safe and sound. But oh, I'm afraid. And so I got to thinking about it, and after I got back and had kids of my own, I can really imagine how traumatized my parents must have been with me going overseas and Buck missing in action. The 99th was convoyed over to England, and then from Liverpool, trained down to Southampton, and they put us in those little box boats that the front lets down in, and took us across the English Channel, 30,000 men in one night. And we were riding in those little boats, bouncing around in the waves, some of the people sick, all night long. In the early morning, they pulled up on the beaches at Le Havre, and we got off and we walked 10 miles to where they had some trucks waiting for us. We called them 8x8s. They had sides that let down to benches and 8 people on either side, but they just put just as many people in them as they could. And we bounced around in the back of those trucks all day, going across France and up into Belgium. And we got up into Belgium where we were supposed to take part, fit in the line, and it was some cold in Belgium. If you've ever been in Belgium in December, it's the coldest place in the world. The ground had snow all over it and was freezing, wind blowing and snowing and sleeting. And when the sergeant opened the back of the truck to let us out, we could hardly get out, but he said, "Be careful where you step. The enemy has planted a minefield all around here." And I don't know how you are careful when you step where you know where there's a minefield. There's just, you kind of gingerly step out, but you don't know what's underneath there. But when we marched off in line, you got behind the fella in front of you, and you took a step where he stepped, and you knew it was okay. And we went down, they marched us down to a little area where our platoon threw down their full field packs, and we conked out and just went dead to sleep. The next day, they took the division and gave different battalions and companies and regiments different locations where they were supposed to be located, and everybody had to dig their foxholes. The ground was frozen stiff. Top 8 inches was just like cement digging through. They put me in a foxhole out on the perimeter near the enemy, and I dug a foxhole out there, and it was really lonesome out there on that perimeter in the evenings when the sun went down and it got dark. I remember one night I was out there by myself, and I heard some crunching coming up behind me in the bushes, and the assistant squad leader named Corporal Shea from Brooklyn said, "Abraham, you're wanted back at battalion headquarters." I said, "Oh, Corporal, get somebody else. I just got off of a detail." He said, "No, they asked for you by name." I thought that was kind of ridiculous. Why would they ask for somebody by name to unload a truck or to dig a latrine or something? But I went ahead and rolled my pack up and and went back to company headquarters, and Corporal Shea took me back to battalion headquarters. There was a lieutenant back there in a little tent, and I reported to him, and he said, "Go out and wake up that Jeep driver out there and tell him to take you back to regimental headquarters." "Yes, sir." I went out and woke up the fellow and said, "Lieutenant said, take me back to regimental headquarters." When I got back to regimental headquarters, there was a major in a little house, and he put me in a command car and had them take me back to division headquarters, back on the other side of Butenbach. I thought I was almost back in Paris. I was in the back of that command car riding along, and at night the MPs had flashlights and they were waving us on down the way. And so that when I got back to division headquarters, they took me up to the G2 section, which is the intelligence section of the division. And a sergeant there said that they were doubling the size of their section because they were going to have a night group and a day group, and they wanted me to, on temporary detached service, to work at night to help them set up the night group. He said, I'm not able to take you down into Butenbach and get you quarters tonight, but if you don't mind, you can go out in that barn behind the house here and sleep tonight, and I'll fix you up in the morning. I didn't mind at all. I went back in that wonderful big barn and went in there. It was warm in there. The chickens were clucking, and the cows were mooing and stomping around, and heat came off of there, and they breathed off heat. And I lay down in some wonderful, sweet-smelling hay, took my full field pack off, took my old wet boots off, took my helmet off, and I lay back there in that hay, and I thought, Abraham, temporarily, you got it made, brother. It wasn't very long after that, just a few days, till all hell broke loose. The Germans mounted a massive, tremendous counterattack. It was planned and designed by Adolf Hitler himself. He didn't even tell his general about what he was doing. His strategy was to come through the 99th and the 106th and pick up the highway going up to Liège and capture the port of Antwerp, where the Allies were getting all of their supplies, and also to divide the British and the American troops. We didn't know at first that it was on an 80-mile front. There were only 3 divisions in the First Army. Above those American divisions were the British, all up into Holland. But over an 80-mile front in Belgium and going down to Luxembourg, there were only 3 divisions. The 106th, the 99th, and the 2nd. And only the 2nd had had any combat experience. The Germans hit between the 99th and the 106th with 19 divisions, many of them Panzer divisions, SS troops, paratroopers they dropped over the lines that had American uniforms on and spoke English. A tremendous artillery barrage preceded their blitzkrieg of hitting the 99th and the 106th. The 99th soldiers, we just gotten there, and we didn't know what war was supposed to be like. We thought this was what it was supposed to be like right at first. And our 99th people hung in there pretty tight. Foot soldiers would pick up the guns and ammunition of their fallen comrades and fall back into the Hirschen woods or get high ground, but never just turn and run. The 106 got completely surrounded. I remember the first time our CP came under heavy artillery fire. They shot those 88s over, and we ran out of the CP and all jumped in our foxhole. My foxhole was out in a field, and I ran out there and jumped in the foxhole, and we could hear those 88s coming over. We called them screaming memes. They kind of whistled, and then you could hear just down the way a mile or so a big crunch, a big explosion. And they raked back and forth, and sometimes they would get pretty close to you. And I guess I, like most every other soldier in those foxholes that night, was praying pretty ferociously. I know I was praying pretty ferociously. I remember praying, please don't let one of those 88s explode in my foxhole. And I had a premonition of a deep voice of God saying to me, Abraham, real deep voice, why should you be spared? And I tried to think of some reason, going to Sunday school wasn't enough. But I couldn't think of anything, and so finally I said, well, I guarantee you, Lord, if you'll give me the chance, I'll make it up to you down the road. I made all kind of commitments and pledges. And it seemed like almost immediately the shelling stopped, and there was just a real silence, as if my prayers had been answered. And I lay there in that foxhole until the sun came up. And when I crawled out of it and looked around, there was a bunch of black holes all around where my foxhole was in the snow. I haven't near been true to the commitments I made that night, but I never forgot it. And it's had a tremendous impact on my life. The Battle of the Bulge took about 2 weeks. The German troops' main juggernaut slid off of the 99th and surrounded the 106, cut off their supplies and their ammunition and their food, and they ultimately all were killed or surrendered. It also headed down toward Bastogne and circled Bastogne, but Bastogne would not surrender. It also headed out towards France. And after 2 weeks, though, it had been real cloudy weather, the skies cleared. After the German mechanized units had been stretched out and their supplies had been dwindling. And when the skies cleared, the Allied forces, air forces, went up and blew their britches off. And the 99th regrouped and came back in and helped push the Bulge back out. Then the 99th and all of the troops in the ETO pushed the Germans back toward the Rhine. Not quickly. They didn't give up quickly. It took about 3 or 4 months to push them back to the Rhine, and when they got there, they crossed over and blew all of the bridges but one. The 99th was the 1st Division in the 1st Army to hit the Rhine. So we were pulled out and sent down to the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen that had been left by the Germans. The detonations they put on there did not go off as they had planned, but they kept trying to blow it up by shelling it in every way they could. In the 3rd Army, they radioed back and said, there's one bridge still standing. What shall we do? Patton said, go on across. And they took 1 battalion across and 2 battalions and then 2 or 3 armored groups. And the 99th was the 3rd Infantry Division to go across that Ludendorff Bridge in Remagen. It just so happened that when I crossed the Ludendorff Bridge in the back of a truck, my old G Company was crossing on foot. And I saw some of my old buddies in G Company walking down on either side. And I waved at them and hollered at them, and they acted like they didn't see me. They were in such a trance, such a fatigued. There was shells coming over and explosions and everything. They looked like they didn't even care what happened. They were just kind of stumbling across. And I knew the hardships. I had seen firsthand the hardships and the dangers that they had been under for the past 3 and 4 months. And I had a sudden attack of survivor's guilt. I crawled back up in back of a box and hid where they couldn't see me, even if they wanted to. We have a short tape that will show you firsthand just a little bit of the hardships that the foot soldiers were going through following the Battle of the Bulge and pushing on to the Rhine.
The first quality of a soldier, Napoleon said, is constancy in enduring fatigue and hardship. Courage is only second. In the final stages of the Battle of the Bulge, the men on both sides were spent. Their army's resources dwindled. All that was left was survival of the most primitive kind. German dead were left to freeze where they fell, past the point of pity. American soldiers sat on them like logs to eat their rations. Blood was so short that American field hospitals had to bleed healthy enlisted men. The men at the front were getting almost no replacements. Platoons of 40 had been ground down to 8 or 10. Still, the command ordered them to turn and fight their way east. In the last few days of January, American troops made their way back to the original lines, the ones they'd held before the German offensive began. The books on the Battle of the Bulge were closed. 16,000 Americans had been killed, 60,000 more wounded or captured. German casualties were said to be twice that. There was no ceremony to mark the end of the battle, not even a headline. The GIs simply kept moving forward into Germany.
Churchill said that the Battle of the Bulge was the greatest American battle in World War II. General Omar Bradley said that the Battle of the Bulge was the costliest battle in American history. The next costly battle in American history was Gettysburg, but there were Americans on both sides. If you would, I would like to pause for a few seconds of silent prayer in gratitude to the soldiers in all wars who have lost their lives to preserve American freedom. Will you bow your head a moment, please? Our Heavenly Father, in the battle that goes on through life, help us to remember when we're tried the sons heroic who have died in freedom's name. And in our humble way, help us to strive to be as brave as they. Amen. When we got across to Remagen, Colonel St. Clair, who was the G2 of the 99th Division, that means the Chief Intelligence Officer of the 99th Division, had his offices in a wine cellar. You couldn't drink it because it was grade, but it was a nice atmosphere for him to have his office in. And after we got over on the beachhead in Remagen, well, he called me into his office, and he told me that Buck had been reported no longer missing in action, and that he was alive and a prisoner of war, a German prisoner of war. And he told me that since I was working at night, if I wanted to take off in the morning and work with the prison release group looking for my brother, that it would be okay with him. So in the Ruhr pocket and all the way we went after that, I was in constant touch with the group that was looking for American prisoners that were released and taking them in and debriefing them and sending them back home. And as we got down to headed south toward the Danube River near Munich, the prison release group told me that there was a large internment camp at Moosburg that was in the line of fire of the 99th Division. One night we captured it. We went past that on into Moosburg and on the other side of Moosburg. And that night they still had the German guard were still around it. But the next morning early, Colonel St. Clair took me down and got me a Jeep. And I went out with a prison release group that took over the camp from the Germans and was in the first Jeep that moved into the camp. There were 14,000 prisoners and forced laborers in that camp. They were living in tents with 300 in a tent. And they were all nations and languages and colors. And at the gate, when we went in, we were just mobbed. You have never seen such celebration that went on. And we were considered to be the ones that were rescued. And they would pat you and kiss you and pull on you and ask you questions and everything. And I had a hard time saying, does anybody know Buck Abraham? And finally somebody said, well, if he's in the Air Corps, you might check down in the Air Corps compound. And so they were all standing by the side of the road, and we rolled down into the Air Force compound, and I saw Buck sitting over on a curb, had his hair all combed and his pants pressed, just like he was waiting to get to liberated. He had tucked his pants up underneath his socks like he had on knickers. He looked very debonair. And he says he recognized me first, and I say I recognized him first, but both of us jumped out and said Bubba and started running towards each other. And we slapped each other on the back and rolled around on the ground and caused a really riot in the prison camp. They said, what's going on here? And I finally said, Buck, we better get out of here. And at first, he didn't want to come to town because he said, they may fly us out of here today, Buck, and we're told not to leave camp. But anyway, I took him on into Moosburg to the little office building that Colonel St. Clair had liberated for a G2 office, and introduced him to all the G2 section and the Colonel St. Clair. And Colonel St. Clair stepped out on the front steps of that office and took Buck in my picture on the 1st of May, 1945, and it was a glorious day. Then I took Buck into town and did what we call liberated a house for him to sleep that night in. We had gotten a communique from General Omar Bradley that said that when we're dealing with German civilians, that sometimes if they mistake kindness for weakness, and he said, be fair, but be firm. So I went up to this house very firmly and demanded that they give mein Bruder was a Kriegsgefangen, a prisoner of war, and that we wanted him to have a nice bed to sleep in that night, and they better fix it up. We'd be back in a couple of hours. And then I took Buck down into Moosburg and ran on into Company G kitchen. A lot of my old buddies had gotten to be battlefield commissions first sergeants. They were all there, and we had a wonderful time, and they gave Buck a wonderful reception. They fed him up big. And that night, I wrote my folks this letter. May the 1st, 1945, Germany. Dear Mother and Dad, just a news flash. Abraham, liberated Abraham. Colonel St. Clair took me down, and I went out to camp and liberated the kid. Oh, happy day. It was wonderful. And at the end, I said, you should have seen Bucky. Life was truly just a bowl of cherries. Signed, the Liberator. P.S. Buck will be home soon. Hot dog. Now you will have the privilege of seeing Buck's version of the day I got him out of the PW camp. And you will tell that the truth will lie somewhere between his version and my version.
I've been looking at Colonel St. Clair telling about when we liberated you in Germany. Do you remember that particular day?
Well, yeah, I guess I do. It'd be one of the biggest days of my life. Would you remember it? I remember it like it happened yesterday. I had been over, and there were 4 compounds in this camp, one of which was Russian. And there had been some Russians in the hospital with me, and they knew the circumstances of the death of my navigator's death. And I went over to talk to them to find out where he was buried and everything. And they all drunk when I got over there. And they'd gotten out and gotten a bunch of sweet vermouth. And they kept kissing me and saying Roosevelt and Stalin. And I never did ever take very kindly to men kissing me. And so I started back to my part of the camp. And I gave out and sat down on a curb. And about that time, this Jeep started trickling down the street. And as it got closer, another POW came out and was sitting by me. And I nudged him and I said, hey, the guy in the right-hand front seat of that Jeep looks like my brother. And this guy grabbed me and put his arm around me and said, easy, fella, don't go around the bend now. You're nearly home. And I said, hell, I'm not going around the bend. I just never did see him in one of those damn iron hats before. And about that time, the Jeep was almost dead in front of us. And I said, hey, Frank. And that Jeep stopped like that, and he just kind of rolled out of the front seat and came around behind the Jeep. And we'd hug, and I'd say, brother, baby. And he'd say, Bubba. And we'd shake hands, and I'd say, Bubba. And you'd hug me, I'd say, brother, baby. And we'd hug and shake hands. And so finally, he said, come on, I want you to go to town with me and get you something to eat. And I said, I can't go into town. I couldn't even get over here in the Russian compound. I had to cut a hole in the fence to come over here. He said, let me talk to it. I said, the colonel would let me come. He said, let me talk to him. So we went in there, and you went walking in there like a typical G.I. Joe. You were courteous, but you were barely. And you saluted him and said, Colonel, I found my brother out here, and he says he's got to have some damn kind of a pass or something to go into town. Could you write him out a pass? He said, found your brother. And he wrote me out a pass. I could have gotten in Fort Knox or Birch's Garden with it. And so we went into town, and we went down there where Colonel St. Clair was, and you took me in there and introduced me to him, and he put his hand on my shoulder and said, Lieutenant, said, are you really Abraham's brother? And I said, yes, sir, I sure am. He said, I'm so damn glad we found you. I don't know what to do. He said, this damn sergeant's drug me through their prison camp east of the Rhine hunting for you. And so we visited a little while, and then he said, did you want to take me down to get me something to eat? And we went over there and some mess sergeant fixed me a whole damn half of a canteen plate full of sea ration stew, which was utterly delicious. I just enjoyed every morsel of it, and I drank one of those canteen cups full of chocolate milk with it. And about 3/4 of the way full, it was so rich, I got violently nauseated and went out and tossed it all and came back and rested for a few minutes and sipped a little water and then ate another canteen cup, mess kit full of it and drank another cup of milk. And then we went down there, and y'all went up there, and like McDonald said, went up there, and I remember that you beat on the door with the butts of your rifles. I'm not sure, but I think you did. And this old woman came to the door, and she was just blubbering around in all kinds of German. And y'all said, "Sprechen Sie Angleterre?" And she said, "No, but there was somebody gave us to understand there was somebody there that did." And this rather horsey old bitch came down there and asked you what you wanted. And you said that I'd been sleeping on a gravel pile. We had gone by my tent before we left, and you saw that wretched place where I was sleeping. And you said I was going to sleep in bed that night. And this woman said, said, "We've got 18 people staying here on account of your troops have displaced all these people." And you said, "Well," said, "I want to see your bedrooms." And so we went up and looked at the bedrooms. So that was before we ate. And you said, "Get all those people out of that bedroom. This will do very well." And if you said, "We might want a little schnapps and something to eat when we get back," and said he wants a bath in the morning. "And if you don't have it ready when I get back, I'm going to burn your damn house down." And I thought, oh my God, what has war done to my brother? The sweetest and nicest guy that ever lived turned into a house-burning monster. And we drove off in that Jeep, and we turned the corner, and you looked over there with a sheepish grin and said, "You know, Bubby, you just have to talk to them like that, and they won't do a damn thing." And so that was how we liberated the house.
I remember when we got a load of a tow sack full of bread and took it back out to your camp, and you pushed it under the tent on about this big tent, and then we went around, and we were about to leave again and go back into town, and one of your crew said, "Hey, Tex, oh, that's all right." You said, "Well, what is it?" He said, "Well, when are we going to bash a slice of that bread?"
I had a friend that said that when he got home, that he was going to get him a big loaf of that old ersatz bread that they gave us. Is about high as sawdust. Old black bread weighed 5 kilos to the loaf. He said he's going to slice off a piece of that black bread, slice off another piece of that black bread, going to plaster both sides up with mayonnaise, and put a piece of white bread between them and make a white bread sandwich.
Well, how did you...
I didn't weigh but 85 pounds.
I know it.
After we got back to La Havre, after I'd been in La Havre, for 4 or 5 days and eating pretty good food,
well,
they weighed me, and I weighed 85 pounds. In PW camp, we were very courteous. We observed, we were in, the one camp I was in was half English and half, Stalag Booth 3 was half English and half American, and the compound I was in. And so the British had tea time every morning and every afternoon. And even though you might just have a meager pittance to eat, an old thin, paper-thin slice of ersatz bread with some real thinned-out cheese spread on top of it, and a cup of tea made out of tea leaves that had been boiled 5 or 6 times where they just put anything with bitter water. And you'd go over and somebody'd be sitting there and they'd be drinking their tea and eating their little piece of bread. And they'd say, "Oh, come in, you've just gotten here in time for tea." And you knew they didn't have anything. They said, "We want you to have tea with us." And you knew they didn't have anything to give you. And so you'd say, "Oh, I couldn't possibly. Oh, boy, I've just had a tremendous bash over at our place. I couldn't eat another thing. Thank you. I'll come back later."
Oh, that was great.
Well, it was a good old day. That was a magnificent day, I'll tell you that. What you and the 99th don't know is that I used to kid these guys in PW camp. And I'd say, "I've got a little brother that's in an infantry outfit in Paris, Texas. And as soon as he finds out where I am, he'll come and get me." And so after we had been liberated, those guys one by one would come back and he said, "My God, your brother did come and get you, didn't he?" And I said, "I told you he would." And so from then on out, all my friends, anytime they see anybody walking down the street, I mean till 1988, they see somebody going along that blue and white Purina patch on, they go up and say, "Son, I don't know whether you know very much about the 99th, but by God, that's the finest infantry outfit that ever was."